In today's episode of the Psychedelic Therapy Frontiers podcast, we're talking with psychotherapist Curt Kearney about his new book, Psychedelics and Internal Family Systems, or IFS, a partnership in relational healing. IFS is a powerful therapy model that's becoming very popular these days. When we talk about which psychotherapy models might pair well with psychedelic tools, IFS is usually somewhere near the top of the list, if not at the top of the list. In his book and in this conversation, Curt draws from his extensive experience with psychedelics and as an IFS practitioner and trainer to walk us through how one might use IFS with psychedelic tools in a synergistic, in a especially relational way. If you want to learn more about Curt, there are links to his website and a link to the book in the show notes. For those of you who are new to our show, welcome. Psychedelic Therapy Frontiers is brought to you by Numinous Network and is hosted by me, Dr. Steve Thayer, and my co-host, Dr. Reid Robison. Just a couple of quick announcements before we get to the interview. If you're looking for comprehensive foundational training in psychedelic-assisted therapy that includes live online classes, experiential learning, and opportunities to connect with a diverse community of practitioners in the psychedelic medicine space, then check out our courses. We're currently offering 10% off select courses for PTF podcast listeners, so click on the link in the show notes or go directly to numinousnetwork.com/training and use the code PDF10 for that 10% discount. If you've listened to the show for a while, you've likely heard Reid and I talk about the psychedelic clinical trial work that Numinous Network does. If you or someone you know might be interested in being a participant in a psychedelic clinical trial, you can click on the link in the show notes or go directly to numinousnetwork.com/research to learn more about the trials we're currently running. If you'd like to support the show, here's how you do it. You can leave us a positive rating or review in places like Apple Podcasts or Spotify. If you're watching on YouTube, please like the video, subscribe to the channel, maybe leave a comment below, and share the episode with someone you think might enjoy it. Without further delay, here's our interview today with psychotherapist Curt Kearney. Welcome back, everybody. Another episode of Psychedelic Therapy Frontiers. Reid and I are honored today to be joined by a guest. It's been a little while, Reid, since we've had a guest on the podcast. So this is cool.
Yeah, it's a treat, especially because we both know Curt.
Yeah. So we've got Curt Kearney here with us to talk about his book, Psychedelics and Internal Family Systems, a Partnership in Relational Healing. I had to glance at my notes. So I didn't have the title.
It's a long title.
Yeah. Really excited because, you know, as longtime listeners of the show will know, Reid and I, over the last couple of years, have gotten some training in internal family systems. We've really enjoyed using it in practice, especially as it dovetails with and plays well with psychedelics. So using it in the context of psychedelic-assisted therapy. So when we learned from Curt that he was coming out with this book, we were like, oh, hot damn, this is perfect. Perfect for our podcast, perfect for our interests, and hopefully for our audience. In fact, Reid and I both met Curt in IFS training. Curt is a program assistant for a lot of those trainings. So I'll stop stealing the thunder. Curt, you want to introduce yourself to our audience?
Yeah, great. Thanks. So my name is Curt Kearney. I'm a psychotherapist in Evanston, Illinois. It's just north of Chicago. Most of my practice is straight ahead, outpatient IFS therapy. I do some ketamine work with my patients, with some of them, and I've had two phases really with psychedelics in my own life, like my adolescence. It's sort of a real crisis, and thankfully, psychedelics helped me get through. And then sort of like second half of life, you might talk about like second half of life, starting about 12, 13 years ago. And that really put me on a path really of researching this book of like, how can, I think, really sort of Western mental health care work with psychedelics in a way that I think honors both psychedelics and honors what, sort of Western mental health care is. I do general practice, like people are coming in, they're depressed or they're afraid their wife is about to divorce them, and they're not necessarily looking for like recommendation to, go spend 6 months in South America and change their name or, and their whole cosmological view. So I really went on a path trying to trying to find, how the hell might we bring these together? And that's how I got to IFS. And yeah, that's how I got to this book. It was like I said in the book, it was very much an experience of, I wish I could have read a book on psychedelics at IFS, but one didn't exist. So instead I spent 5 years, a lot of my personal time, writing a book on it so that I could read it.
Well, thank you for doing that, Curt, on behalf of like the planet Earth, because I've been anxiously awaiting someone to write this book. And Steve mentioned that Curt was our like program assistant, but essentially one of our IFS teachers. And I recall you, Curt, as being so sincere and compassionate, and as one of our teachers, you would lead us in through like small groups, learning tricky topics on the matter and practicing with each other on IFS and all sorts of things. So yeah, it's really neat to have this come full circle where you have birthed this creation that I know Steve and I both have felt, and so many others, that the field really needs, because it's a pairing that makes sense and can be magical even from our experiences. And we all need some guidance. And then when I got a copy of your book, thank you for sharing. I was really excited from the get-go of how well it's written. So I'm excited to chat more.
Awesome. Thanks.
Sounds like it's been a long time in the making. Not only the writing it, you said 5 years, but a long time sort of coming out of your experience, your authentic experience, your parts, your life, and also trying to meet a need. And I love that you responded to that old adage, like, write the book that you wish existed in the world, right? Write the book that you wish you had. So maybe you could, is there anything else about sort of the path that took you to where you are now, publishing this book, that you think might be relevant to set us up before we dive into the content?
I do think one thing that has been an important frame for me in thinking about this whole topic, and then thinking about the book, I know, like, I sort of came back to this as an adult fairly early in this, like, I call it like the second Western psychedelic renaissance. I think the first one was like 1950s, 60s, early 70s. And at that time, there really, I don't think there was a clear sense, at least that I got. I read some of the papers that were out there, some of the early papers, and they were very exciting. But there wasn't a clear sense. Yeah, again, like, how do you pair this with psychology, with psychotherapy, with a healing path, and how do you help people work with this in some sort of rich, ongoing way? So, and again, I was sort of getting steeped more in some of the South American traditions, which are very communal. And I was thinking that, oh my God, like, this psychedelic stuff coming into Western mental health care might make Western mental health care more communal, more community oriented, more relational. And then I was kind of shocked that, it seemed like, okay, we need randomized control trials. The FDA needs them, regulatory agencies need them. They're good science. Try and have a single variable, try and get rid of all the confounds. But I was like, I got the sense that there was a feeling of, okay, we're having really good outcomes of these short-term, very individualized, randomized control trial processes with psychedelics and psychotherapy to some extent. So this is how you do this. This is how you pair Western psychology and psychedelics. And, at the time, me and my friends, we were reading some of these papers, and we're like the results were so good. And we were like, are we doing something wrong? Are we not doing enough psychedelics? Are we doing the wrong ones? I kind of had the feeling that once psychedelics maybe get prescribable and widely available, that this sort of short-term, individualized, randomized control trial model was not going to hold up. And that was a big worry of mine, that people were going to be expecting these huge results that are showing up in the papers, the articles, and that might not happen so much in general practice. And then there was some of the work. Was it Suresh Murthaswamy did some really great work on looking at some of the expectancy effects and placebo effects at play in these studies. And I did a little work in one of the psilocybin randomized control trials. And again, I get the randomized control trial. It's a good scientific model. I'm not dissing on it. It does what it's a tool for its job. It's a scientific discovery model. But I could see, we had an N of 110. So 110 people were going to get into the study. We had 60,000 applications, 60. So it really seemed to me like the people who were meeting criteria and getting in and everything, I was starting to think of it as like this Willy Wonka golden ticket effect. And I was like, how much of that is powering some of these outcomes? Yeah. And so again, I had a big worry, like sort of as a clinician, are we setting people up for too big of expectations, that when we don't have maybe this golden ticket effect of the randomized control trial process, are people going to be disappointed? And is that going to be dangerous? And, and how can we really continue to help people with psychedelics? So, I looked under a lot of rocks, it's like, okay, maybe the holotropic breathwork stuff, great, great stuff. But it still felt like, I don't know if I could refer, like someone comes into my practice again, like, I'm depressed. I don't know if I could say like, okay, like, let's go, breathe for 8 hours and have this incredibly loud music and see what happens. And it still didn't have, some of that. One of the groups I worked with has had really a nice community going for like 20 years with that stuff. So they seem to be getting at some of the community, some of the really ongoing relationality. But it was really and I didn't know about IFS at the time, so it was really like, for me, middle of the night in Brazil, like 3 a.m., I'm beat to shit. And this sense of family, that's the word that gets me in IFS, is family. Like, what if I treated my inner world like, I have 3 kids. What if I treated my inner world like it was family? And I was like, I got to learn about this stuff. So that was really like the turning point for me. I was like, I think this might be the stuff where we can bring this into sort of a general practice model, and it's a rich model that can partner with psychedelics and can be ongoing, helpful for people, and does have a rich sense of relationality on the inside, and I think on relationships with the world and with others. And it really bore out. I started my own IFS therapy and was like, and it's like, this is, I don't think IFS and psychedelics do the same exact thing, and I think that's kind of great that they don't, because I think they can be partners, like, let's say, like, parents raising kids, the parents don't need to be the same person. There can be a diversity of perspectives, and that can be really good for the kids. So I think like IFS and psychedelics can have this great kind of ecosystem that can be just really, really good for people. So so then I was like, all right, I got to write this book.
Nice. So the IFS and psychedelics are like 2 complementary parents in this kind of loving, like family healing journey, perhaps. But I love that question. And, it brings up this burning age-old question I've always had of, why do we treat ourselves so harshly at the get-go? Because I love the wake-up call that your question brings. Even every time I hear it, it's like, oh yeah, like the love I feel for my kids, like I can't even describe it to them because it's such a unique and powerful phenomenon that is in there, and I can draw on it at any moment. And we forget that so easily, or it seems like we all have to learn to love ourselves and be more kind and gentle. But I'm wondering if you have thoughts on why it's that way, Curt. The unanswerable question, perhaps.
Well, I think one answer, I'm not saying it's the end all be all, but I think one answer is, the process of exiling, what IFS talks about is exiling. I think when we go through an experience of trauma or deprivation, it's, if it's, it can be fucking awful. It can be hell on earth. And I think especially if we go through it too alone, we don't have outlets to talk about that and get support. Kind of this idea that two people can go through a similar kind of trauma, and if one person is in sort of a rich, intimate, emotional, relational matrix, they don't tend to wind up getting like what we might call PTSD. Versus if someone's like alone with those experiences too much, that's when we maybe get more stuff that we call PTSD. And I think that process of exiling, let's say for a child or even an adult, like what do we do with an experience of hell on earth? And maybe we have to exile it. It can seem so noxious, so that it's going to, it might kill us. It might kill like what IFS calls self, might kill sort of our sense of beinghood, that's on the line. Or it might be so noxious to the people in our lives that if we're carrying that around, are we going to infect people in our lives? So I think that's where then the protectors come in, and they're like, hell no. Like, we got to get rid of this noxious stuff. And then, the parts of us that have been stuck carrying those burdens of the trauma or deprivation, they get locked up. They get treated like prisoners. They get treated like they're the monsters that need to be hunted and removed. And so I think it's a weird thing, but I think, a lot of what we call like self-hatred and self-attack is with the best of intentions. It's, to try and survive, to protect ourselves, and maybe to protect the people in our lives. And if that keeps going, if there's not an intervention in there, right? If there's not some, relational connection of love and connection for those exiles and those protectors, they're just going to keep doing their jobs indefinitely.
Yeah. I love that very important reminder as well of, just the well-meaning nature of, how some of this begins. And it's making me think on my own question is, like, even coming to this earth when we're born is a traumatic separation of sorts from the womb. And I was always puzzled by the fact that you have these, like, snakes are born with the ability to bite, or like you have these kind of creatures who can function almost independently, quicker in development than humans. I'm like, babies need to be cared for to survive. What's going on? But like, don't animals learn the vital skills like as efficiently as possible from genetic evolution? Then I'm like, oh yeah, maybe what our most vital skill is asking for help, right? Like babies cry. And it's just been part of my journey in therapy and psychedelics of learning that asking for help is actually a sign of strength rather than weakness. And it goes along with, of course, the vulnerability of all that. But so, yeah, thanks for connecting some dots by, humoring the big questions with me.
Yeah, no, I love that. I love that about asking for help. And I think that asking for help, I've seen that over and over. I think that's something that people learn or they get a chance to enact in a medicine session. You get
Mm-hmm.
right, your protectors aren't working. Maybe they sort of go to sleep, or maybe they're like, I can't protect from this, and
Yeah.
there can be that experience of asking for help. And I think that can be a profound shift for people, and that, right. And talk about integration, like, that's something, that we can bring into the rest of our lives.
Yeah, and that brings up kind of another question I wanted to ask is, so you have this pairing that I think we all agree and have had some experience with is potentially quite powerful, of IFS and psychedelics. And IFS you could consider psychedelic in its own right, like many things you could consider psychedelic. But what is it about medicine, like you mentioned, protectors kind of going offline or stepping aside, perhaps? Like what's going on in the magic of this pairing as you deconstruct it, do you think?
Yeah, well, I think it's an interesting question. One thing that comes to my mind, and I think there's maybe two ways of framing that question. Do the protectors recede and go offline? Or maybe another way of stating the same thing is there more self there? Um, and I think sort of both can happen. I think protectors. I mean, I've seen it. I've seen it in myself. Um, I think protectors can sort of like get into like the sort of hippie cliche of sort of like, I'm just going to go with it, like mellow out, man, like let's let this experience happen. I think protectors can sort of get into that. God, it's funny. I was thinking about there's a scene in Cheech and Chong movie, Up in Smoke, at the end when there's the cops find the van, where they're smuggling the cannabis. The van is made out of cannabis, and the van caught on fire somehow. And so the cops are getting incredibly high as this van burns. And yeah, both in those cops, they decide to just go with it. And I think they eat a bunch of hot dogs. And, so there's these like protectors, these cops
That's
who are
awesome.
going with it. Yeah, I love that. I love that movie. So I think there can be this thing where the protectors maybe just decide like, yeah, I'm just going to go with it. Let's let this happen. Um, and I think there can also be a thing where the protectors, they can kind of maybe start to see the futility of their efforts. That, um, I think protectors can manifest very strongly in sessions, and then they maybe have to see like, oh, I'm just gonna be calm. I'm gonna keep it cool. Everything's gonna be fine. I'm gonna figure this out. And that's not gonna work with like a high dose medicine session. And I think they maybe, it's almost like maybe prescribing the symptom. Like they have to see like at a certain point, like, holy shit, I can't protect from this. Maybe I haven't been able to ever really protect that great. Maybe I've been doing my damnedest and it really hasn't been working. And maybe I think then they can choose to to maybe say, why don't I try something different? Why don't I let this exile be available for healing? And I think, and that's where it's really important, that there's a sense of safety and a healing situation. And I think, and I think the medicines bring that. Um, they're, I know there's this idea that maybe psychedelics are just neutral tools and we can use them for good or ill, whatever. I personally don't buy that. Um, the like the CIA back in the 50s, 60s with like MK Ultra, they were trying to weaponize psychedelics. They wanted to use psychedelics as tools of torture and interrogation and assassination. They wanted to sort of like try and program people to, like bodyguards to kill like some head of state who they were, guarding. The Nazis were doing this too. I think a lot of the governments did this. They were very interested in how can we weaponize these? How can we militarize these? And they failed. The CIA decided like, no, we're gonna do, torture and interrogation, through psychological means or, other means. They gave up on psychedelics. They couldn't weaponize them. But at least not reliably. But if we look at, psychedelics for healing, that's been going on, for who knows how long and in all sorts of cultures. So to get back to your question, I think, with healing medicines present, then I do think maybe the protectors can be like, hey, this is an opportunity for me to do something different. There's a healing force here. Why don't I let this exile out of the cage? Why don't I give this exile's been crying for years for a chance to be heard and be helped. Maybe this is the time to do it.
So, Curt, this conversation about how protector parts might respond to psychedelics makes me think about something in your book that's really important that you talk about. And that is, I think the way you describe it is good enough consent from all parts.
Right.
We've discussed in the podcast before the complications of getting informed consent for something like psychedelics. It's really hard to describe what people are going to experience. I've had clinical trial participants and clients, after thorough descriptions in the preparation phase, say during or after the medicine phase, there's no way I could have predicted what that would be like. So
interesting, right?
Yeah, what's good enough consent? This context.
Right. And I think maybe, and I think the good enough consent from all parts to before doing a medicine session to do the medicine session is, it's respectful of them. And I think it's very practical, because otherwise I think you can get into stuff like bad trips where parts are like, I did not freaking sign up for this. Make it stop. Let me out. So I think ethically and just, like clinically, pragmatically, it's really important. It's one of the things that I love about bringing IFS into this work is that instead of just getting consent from sort of one part of our patient, like, oh, like, are you up for this? Yeah, I'm totally up for it. We've heard from one
Who's
part
speaking?
of them. Right. So really opening up the conversation, opening up the field, like, do you have any doubts? Do you have any hesitancies? Do you have any anxieties? Do you have any asks about this? I think, and I Steve, I love, I think maybe part of a good enough consent is saying, you can't actually know what this is going to be like. Maybe that has to be like on the literal or figurative, consent form. Like, you are consenting to something or not consenting if they don't want to consent to something that, you don't know what it's going to be like. And that's part of the process. And I think, I think parts can then, I think good enough consent, like I work with a lot of people who are naive to psychedelics. Like, again, I'm mostly I'm doing general practice, and I do get some people who are like, I want to do psychedelic work, but a lot of it is I'm just doing general practice, and like, people are hitting treatment resistant kind of conditions, and really maybe their psychiatrist is recommending that we bring ketamine into the therapy. So I think there can be this sense of like, one good enough consent can be like an experimental frame, like saying to parts, like, after discussing, like, you might hate this. You might feel like you're losing your mind. You might not know who you are. You might want to puke. Uh, you know, um, Trying to be honest about these things, and if people have worries, like, am I going to stay this way forever? What if I fry my brain like an egg? Especially for people who were around in the '80s for all those commercials. Um, and being able to address that, like, Nancy Reagan was wrong. You're, and I think it's more complex, but yeah, but then maybe going to parts and maybe saying, what about trying one session? And there doesn't have to be like, yeah, I'm signing up for 6 sessions of ketamine or 3 sessions of psilocybin, but it's maybe like, what about trying one session and then reevaluating, sort of gathering the data and analyzing the data. Uh, I think something like that can be good enough consent. There's another thing, yeah, that I wrote about in the book that has blown me away about consent. I really think certain parts can opt out of a medicine session. I don't know if you guys have seen this. I'd be really curious. It seems so unexplainable to me, but I've seen it where, a part might be like, okay, I get it. Like these exiles need healing. The protectors get it. You know, like self is on board. This seems like a reasonably safe situation. The therapist seems like a good person, but I don't want anything to do with this psychedelic stuff. And that part can, I think we can offer them. Um, Maybe you sit out the session. You don't have to participate. You can go somewhere else during the session, and it seems to work.
Yeah, I mean, what you're describing, I think, is another take maybe on the subtitle to your book about it being a
Mm.
partnership in relational healing. I mean, you started by talking about collective approach to healing, in contrast with sort of the atomized, one person on the couch across from one therapist thing. But this is an internal partnership, a partnership with the medicine. And so you're compassionately bringing forward the multiplicity that is in a person where one might not be on board and maybe they have options. So as you're negotiating this and trying to make sure that they know what's available to them, there might be a part that would sit it out, so to speak. I've also seen, I think, at least one way of thinking about it is kind of the opposite, where in a medicine session, and a part shows up and kind of shuts things down, whether it's trying to
Mhm.
wrestle control away from the experience and it leads to something that's really chaotic and difficult to endure. Or, I've seen people where it's an hour after they've taken their medicine and they're not feeling much. And it isn't until the concerns of that part are addressed that all of the sudden, all of the subjective effects of the psychedelic come rushing in. It's really interesting how much power certain parts have over the psyche.
Right, right, right. Yeah, that isn't that amazing? That, yeah, like a high dose session, and right, nothing's happening. I mean,
Right.
right, like sort of biochemically, my like high school biology understanding of this stuff is like, that makes no damn sense, but it happens.
But yeah, the parts of us can be quite powerful, right? And yeah, it's, you know, equally puzzling and also not surprising once you get to know both psychedelics and IFS that this kind of thing can happen on such an individual basis. But I was just rewinding a tiny bit. I'm wondering if it might be useful if you could even just briefly walk through how would you go about getting consent from your parts and or checking if you have self energy on board for those listening who maybe have done some IFS, maybe therapists starting to work with this or individuals kind of doing their own work who might want to check in sometimes. Wondering if you could elaborate a little bit.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. Well, I think the maybe the place to start with that is to make sure that that we're in self when we're working on that sort of consent or not consent. Um, yeah, I don't want to go too technical deep dive, but I think we could think about if we're if we're in self in a relationship, I think one way of thinking about it is we're going to be respectful. And so I think it's really key before even asking any questions about consent. IFS has all these great checking questions, about is your patient in self? Are you in self? And the really stereotypical and I think kind of magical one is, I think if we're working with someone else, like, how do I feel towards the parts of this person? Or how do I feel towards this person? And I think that can give us a sense of if we're basically in a relationship of respect. And if we're feeling impatient, if we're like, oh God, I got to get through this consent. I got to finish this session, or maybe we're really excited. That's been a pitfall for me. Maybe like, I really want to do this medicine session. This is amazing stuff. This is so exciting. If we're feeling like a little impatient, like, let's get this consent done. I want to do this. If we're feeling like, no, if we're feeling like respect, or like, the 8C kind of stuff, if we're feeling compassion, connection, clarity, God, what else are there? I don't know. Those are a few that I really like.
Even Dick forgets all 8. I've
right.
I've heard him on interviews. Yeah, compassion, curiosity, all that stuff.
Right. So if I think that's the first thing. Like, are we in self? Are we being respectful? Are we in a respectful relationship as we're going to ask the questions about consent? I think that's really the first thing. And let's say we are, then I think it's like, yeah, we really, again, well, those C words, out of compassion, we want to know, what are these parts feeling? What are they thinking? Because it matters to us, because we have compassion for them. They're like the inner children, and they've maybe been through a lot, whether it's protectors, protectors are inner children, and they've maybe been doing horrible jobs for years and years and years. And, to have that compassion that, hey, I want to hear from these little kids, and the curiosity, that we really want to know, like, it's interesting to us, like, it's important to us what they're feeling or thinking. And I think, to a large extent, I think things then kind of flow from there. But I think really asking, are there any concerns? Are there any worries? Are there any fears? Are there any reticences from anything in the person? And I'll ask people to really maybe get somatic with it. Sometimes I feel like some parts can kind of hide in shadows in our body, whatever that means. So maybe moving a bit, maybe breathing a bit, so they can, start to find and really welcome more parts of themselves, maybe parts who have gotten, sort of swept to the side a bit. And also, one thing I think is really important with consent from parts before a medicine session, I like to think about at least letting that be a 2-session process. Like, it doesn't have to be like sign on the dotted line in one session. Maybe in between sessions, parts in the patient have a time to have some just spontaneous dialogue and talk with their friends, their loved ones, do some research, and maybe come back to a second session, maybe with fresh questions, or maybe with a fuller sense of like, yeah, I can really consent to this, well enough. Yeah, so I like the idea of at least 2 sessions around this.
Makes me, your mentioning of the 2 sessions makes me think of the actual structure of an IFS plus psychedelics therapeutic protocol or approach. And you talk about sort of different approaches in the books, even different approaches using different dosages, like the so-called psycholytic dose or the full psychedelic doses. And I imagine you might do, you even talk about in the book too, which I'd love to hear you expound on what you're actually doing, right? You're doing IFS, doing parts work in the preparation. Are you doing parts work during the medicine session? What does IFS look like in integration? And are there
Right.
more medicine sessions thereafter?
Right. Great. Yeah. Yeah. The medicine, I think there's a big consensus sort of in the field that IFS can be amazingly good for preparation work and for integration work. I think very few people would argue with that. Maybe that's putting it too far, but I think, there's a lot of acceptance around that. And I think, yeah, I'd love to talk more about integration work. I love it. And I think IFS has so much to bring there that is kind of lacking maybe in a lot of sort of Western mental health care. Again, that bringing an atomized sort of frame to integration, it's maybe not going to work that great. But in medicine sessions, I think it's more controversial. And what I tend to think about in my practice and from my training, from the some of the great people I've been able to study with and talk with about this. I think in really high dose medicine sessions, we're probably not going to be doing a lot with how do you feel towards that part of yourself? Could you ask them to unblend from you? How old are they? We might not be able to get away with that. Just the intensity and even like the cognitive sort of machinations might not just support that. But, I really think it's really crucial that we're still doing IFS then, that we as therapists are still present as self in compassion, in connection, in presence. All those good C words and P words. Because my sense a lot of times with medicine sessions, and Michael and Annie Midhofer talked about this. I was lucky enough to do MAPS training with them. That somehow these medicines bring up, what's called like the index traumas, if we're talking about PTSD. And they said that they've done a bunch of the MAPS. They've led a bunch of the MAPS, research sessions themselves, and they've supervised tons of people doing those sessions. They said they never had to ask a research participant to, work to bring up the index traumas. They always just manifested in the medicine session. And so when that's going on, again, if we go with this idea that some of what makes what we call, trauma and deprivation so freaking noxious is the relational aloneness of it, that maybe, the expected proper relational bounds were violated by someone being cruel, or just being too alone with an experience, not being able to share it with anyone, not being able to get any support from anyone, that when these index traumas are coming up, those parts are, their kind of psychological scene that they're in, they're probably wrongfully alone. They're too much alone. And so even if we can't do, a lot of overt IFS therapy, it's maybe a little woo-woo-ish, but if we're there as self, if we're present with our patient, we're present with their parts, we're in compassion, we're in connection. I think that's part of what makes these sessions healing. It's, you could, a really mechanical way of putting it would be like the memory reconsolidation stuff. It's a chance for those memories to be recontextualized as not experiences of such wrongful aloneness. And I think, that's partially an argument. I know there can be movements in this, the Western psychedelic field to really limit therapy and have session monitoring. or psychological support as opposed to psychotherapy. And I think that this is one of the areas where like session monitoring or psychological support is too weak. And I think it could be dangerous. It could be unethical. I think it could be inhumane. Um, I have a quote in the book. God, I can't remember. It's from Richard Schwartz. He said something like, anytime we're relating to our patient's parts from ourself, we're doing IFS, whether we're using IFS kind of language or not. So yeah, I think in high dose medicine sessions, one thing that's really important is that we're there as self, as a therapist, and and then I think then there's more the lower dose, and then the maybe like sunset period of a high dose medicine session where I think there can be really just overt therapy, maybe short, maybe 10 minutes of really IFS therapy that's probably been set up by the prep work, that there have been certain parts that have been in consent to be in therapy in the medicine session.
Yeah, that makes sense, and it tracks with the way I've found myself using IFS paired with psychedelics, setting the table in preparation sessions, doing parts work, helping them think of themselves in terms of parts, experiencing what it's like to make self-to-part contact, and then if it's a high dose medicine session, doing the things we talk about in other psychedelic therapy trainings, like getting out of the way. Why am I talking? It's pretty miraculous, and maybe one of the reasons why IFS pairs so well with psychedelics, the way that psychedelics tend to bring up parts sort of spontaneously. People have an experience of being in multiplicity often on psychedelics, whether they've had IFS or not. And I like what you describe in the sunset period, and that's been my experience with some of my clients, is that, once some of those ego structures are coming back online, maybe some of the protectors are coming in from the sidelines or what have you, that's sometimes a good time, but I agree that it's usually best if it's truncated. And then with lower doses, like psycholytic doses, like I've seen recordings of Richard Schwartz doing IFS with couples and ketamine, for example.
Yeah.
And so there's probably multiple use cases, but I like the frame that you're putting around it.
Yeah. And again, and I do, it's like a soapbox I have. I am concerned about like sort of a modernist, atomized take on this, on psychedelic work in Western mental health, being problematic. And psychedelic-assisted psychotherapy. I think if we're doing that, we need therapists there. Mm-hmm. If we don't have therapists there, we're doing something different. Maybe we're doing something that's good or fine, but it is not psychedelic-assisted psychotherapy. Even in medicine sessions, right? Even like you're saying, even if it's why am I talking and not talking? Mm-hmm. That is psychotherapy. A lot of times I tell people I work with that a lot of what I'm going to be doing, especially during a high dose medicine session, is trusting them, trusting all their parts, protectors and exiles, and trusting the medicine. And that's not nothing. Mm. For people to be held in trust is, I think it can be sort of a corrective emotional experience to some extent. People have talked about that, like people have tended not to trust me. That this is a really high stakes situation, and you're saying you trust me with this. And and then I think that can lead into some powerful integration.
Yeah, and I agree with all that. And it's interesting as a clinical trialist that we have to navigate this regulatory pathway, like these hoops to jump through that are tricky ones, including the fact that the FDA requires us to strip everything away and isolate the intervention to not just like magic mushroom but like this a synthetic version of psilocybin without alkaloids, because we want to know what's doing what. And and I think we're facing this really interesting challenge right now of defining or trying to stick things into boxes of what is psychotherapy, what is like dosing session support, and also how do we test the effect of a medicine with kind of support around it or with a simple structure. But one thing that gives me kind of reassurance is after we get through these hurdles, then clinicians can kind of add in 20 more prep sessions if they want, and hopefully they will like layer on more and more of that. But I think it's coming to the protocols. I've certainly been like talking with Dick about them for years and piloting things we can, but it's coming more randomized controlled trials that will have formal psychotherapy modalities in them, like especially IFS. But it is a tricky time we're in, and I think kind of a necessary challenge and paradigm shift for the field, where the FDA doesn't know what to do with the combination, as we saw as part of the complication of the MAPS MDMA approval, and committee, debacle or drama, if you will. But anyway, that's just a perspective out of Steve and I both. We straddle this fence and work on the research and clinically, and there's different challenges in each path.
Yeah. And again, I said it before, but I really want to underline it, because I think our field can get, like in IFS, we talk about parts getting into extreme roles. I think, our field can get into extreme roles of paradigms of like maybe like ultra alternative or like ultra conventional, and extreme roles. They're not going to be our friends. I love the randomized control trials. I mean, I think they are the way it's sort of got to be done scientifically, especially at this point with. Right, the FDA wants to know, are these safe and effective drugs? You do randomized control trials. The concern I have is that then as a field, if we go, okay, we know how to do this now, we just keep, in general practice, we just keep doing randomized control trial sort of protocols. That's more my concern. And I get concerned about people who want to completely throw out the research and say, "Oh, this is useless." Like, we need multiple paradigms, and we need the paradigms working together. We need the paradigms in dialogue and in friendship. I think, including like modernist science, and and maybe some of the more psychological, psychotherapeutic, and maybe some of the more psychospiritual stuff. I think if all of this can be in like a friendly or even a familial kind of relationships, we're going to do the best as a field.
Amen, Curt. I think, your book, I'm just sort of noticing as I'm zooming out and reflecting on the loose structure of our conversation so far today. We've talked a bit about what IFS in psychedelics looks like with preparation, a little bit about medicine sessions. We've hinted at integration. And your book even structures it this way, providing great case examples, things you might do differently with IFS paired with psychedelics in each of these phases of psychedelic-assisted therapy. What does integration look like with IFS?
Yeah, right. And I think, and this is so important to me, and I think so important to so many people. Like, I think this is like the $64,000 question with psychedelics. I've been working with psychedelics since I was 16. That's 39 years. And, and like very quickly, I think everyone who works with psychedelics is sort of like, now what? What do I do now? And yeah, like I make this, I try to make a case in the book that I think there can be, at least in the sort of modernist West, an idea that psychology is very sort of mechanized, even if it's sort of cognitively mechanized. That psychology could be, sort of computer networks or like software systems or software data, and that integration should be sort of upgrading those networks or debugging some of the software or upgrading some of the software or improving the data sets. And my sense is that's not going to go far enough, because I think we're not computers walking around in warm skin. I think we're beings in relationships. So I think with integration, and I think this dovetails so well with IFS. I think it's about ongoing relationships. And it's the same thing in standard IFS. Let's say someone, you work with someone in IFS psychotherapy session, and their protectors agree to allow access to an exile, and that exile comes into relationship with self, and really get some healing, maybe gets a profound healing, gets unburdened of like the muck and all the secondary crap that they've been carrying since the traumas or deprivations. Then those relationships need to be integrated, and I think I think we can bring that sort of relational sense into the psychedelic work, that if the healings from medicine sessions, if we can find, sort of, maybe not even so much what did we learn or what changed in the medicine session, but who did it change in us?
Mm-hmm.
Who learned something, and
Yeah.
and then we can establish relationship with those parts, and those relationships can be lifelong. If you have a little part who, there's, I quote the Mithofer's work with Nick, a Marine vet who was in some of the MDMA PTSD study work. At one point in one of his medicine sessions, he found himself, oh God, I'm probably going to cry. He found himself as a child, with a brightness that outshone fire.
It's beautiful.
Yeah, isn't it?
Yeah.
So if he can then be in relationship, and if we can help with like IFS work, like find that child after the medicine sessions, how does that child want to hang out with you? Yeah. Do they want to sit in your lap?
Yeah. And you get to have your inner child, that beaming light, with you all the time, more often. Yeah, that's beautiful. I think in your book you said something like, integration is relationship, and I thought that was really that was profound and thought provoking. And like, we don't want the healing to be just a flash of health only, and so we integrate, and the focus on relationship, I think, is really profound. There's another component of, I guess, integration in the work I wanted to ask, and I know as much as I'd love to ask a million more questions, we don't have infinite time. So this is probably the last question from my end, but it's about the body and psychedelics, just because it's been something that's really called to me as a modality. The somatic component, for all the work we do in mental health, not just the things I do in like eating disorders specifically, but you said something else in your book, I think, that stood out at me, that okay, I gotta find it. the body as
Maybe I can find it.
meaning, not just mechanism. And wondering, because that made me pause, I'd love to get your take on what's underneath that deep quote.
Yeah. And I think it's a sense of our bodies as inseparable from us as beings. Again, that we're not like, this mini computer that's being carried around by our bodies, but our bodies are utterly integral to us as beings. And one thing that I think psychedelics have really highlighted that for me. Psychedelics have bodies. They have physicality. And when we work with a psychedelic, they become part of our bodies. We ingest a substance into the substance of our body, and this affects our psychology profoundly for a while, maybe for the rest of our lives. So I think psychedelics point up how much psyche and soma, like soul and body, soma the somatic, are two sides of one coin. Emotions show up in our bodies, right? Our physical feelings, if we have some, pain in our back, it's going to show up in our psychology. I think honoring our bodies, I think our parts show up in our bodies so much. So I think part of it is, it's again, like maybe it's part of integration. Like one thing, I have that line. I love that you love that line. It's one of my favorite too. I sort of remember when that line hit, that like integration is relationship. And I think part of it is relationship within a diverse ecosystem that really complexifies, that enriches. Ecosystems, when they're healthy, they develop season after season. And our bodies as part of that ecosystem, and being respectful about our bodies. How does our soul, how does what's most important about us show up in our bodies? How does it manifest in our bodies? Or, our loved ones, our friends, our enemies, how did their psyches, their souls manifest in their bodies? And really just honoring that. Yeah, and I think it's a different sense, again, than body as mechanism or as computation, which has reality, but I think it's not the most important reality that we're dealing with in our psyches or our bodies.
Yeah, no, thank you for that. I love the point about the mind and the body just being inseparable, because I think, the more you do this kind of work, the more you realize that the mind and the body are so mutually interactive and influential. Like when you engage the body, you engage the psychological activities and emotional activities. But when you engage the mind, like do a psychological intervention or emotionally oriented one, you automatically engage the body. And I think it's great news that the field discovered that, and IFS includes that, because the body-based approach my take is it helps us avoid a lot of these labyrinths of the mind we can get caught up in by just focusing on the mental parts of it only, and you're missing all those manifestations of the unseen things that show up through the body, like you mentioned, our emotions and the action tendency and everything else that comes along with that. But anyway, it's a topic of its own. But thanks for elaborating on that really fun quote. But yeah, Steve, do you have other burning questions? We have a few minutes.
I know we're sort of at the end of our agreed upon time. Just a couple reflections. So thinking about integration as relationship has got me thinking about how that frame or that metaphor, that context could be really helpful for what tends to be challenging for folks in integration, where it can be tough to leverage the experiences one had, the insights one had, the questions that come up that one had for durable change, right, in life. But if you think if integration is relational, you can think of, in terms of your parts, like new relationships after a psychedelic experience. And with new relationships, you have that honeymoon energy where you think all's going to be well, or you have, some trust, but also some wariness based on previous similar relationships. There can be ups and downs. There can be different chapters to relationships, but this is sort of a freshly baked thought. But I just love the idea of thinking about new relationships with parts after such a mind manifesting, soul manifesting experience. So I just wanted to sort of reflect that back to you. Your discussion about the mind and the body, though, reminded me of a quote in your book where you quoted Barry Magid, I think.
Yeah.
This was just so fun. Minds belong to people, not brains. The mind is no more inside the brain than the dance is inside the muscles. I like that. That was fun. That was cool.
Yeah. Barry's got a way with images.
Yeah.
And you have a way with collecting cool quotes that inspire images. So thanks for sharing those, sprinkling those.
Anytime I read a book like Curt's where there are like so many good quotes, I'm just like, no wonder this book took 5 years plus. You have to have collected a lot of wisdom over the years to draw from it all.
And I want to say, as part of the process of the book, this is really touching for me, talking with you guys, because this book, I think I said in the acknowledgments, and I really meant it, it grew one conversation at a time. And it was like a gestation process. It was like this little fetus would be would sort of elaborate its structure in through a conversation. And I feel like this is happening here. It's and even just thinking about it, thinking about coming on here has been such a rich space to be able to sort of play with some of these ideas and fill in some of that space. And I've learned a lot from you guys talking with you guys today.
Well, thank you, Curt. And there's one more quote I just have to share that's by you, I believe, that says, "We're all young here." Something like, we need questions at least as much as we need answers. That might be about all we get. It can be pretty damn good. Does that sound like something you wrote?
Yep, that very much does.
Yeah, I love that message. Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, thanks, Curt. Really appreciate you coming on. Why don't you tell people where they can find more information about you and, of course, the book?
Yeah. So the book will be out, I think, the same day as this podcast. That's a fun synchronicity.
Oh, cool.
So what is that, Tuesday, May 19th?
Oh, cool.
I'm going to have wider distribution. It's going to be available May 19th at a certain mega corporation. And then it'll have wider distribution after that. If you want to know, more about me or what I'm up to, you can hit my website. It's just curtkearney.com.
And that's CurtKearney, but we'll link it in the show notes as well, as well as to the link to the certain mega corporation where they can find your book.
Great.
Thanks, Curt. It's
all right.
Been
Thank you,
touching.
guys.
It's been a pleasure.
Likewise. Right. Thanks, guys. All right. Hope to talk soon.
Psychedelic Therapy Frontiers is brought to you by Numinous Network, a company committed to helping people heal and be well by delivering technology-driven clinic support, clinical trial research, and comprehensive practitioner training in psychedelic-assisted therapy. You can learn more about Numinous Network at numinous.com. That's NUMINUS.com. If you enjoyed the show today and you want to support us, here's how you do it. You can leave a rating or review on places like Apple Podcasts and Spotify, subscribe to the Numinous YouTube channel, like the YouTube videos, and share the show with somebody you think might enjoy it. If you're interested in comprehensive training in psychedelic-assisted therapy, check out our courses at numinous.com/training. These courses are carefully crafted by Numinous professionals like myself, Reid, and others, and include live online classes, experiential learning, and opportunities to connect with a diverse community of practitioners in the psychedelic medicine space. I really love teaching these courses and connecting with you all, so check out numinous.com/training, and I hope to see you at the next training cohort. The content of this podcast does not constitute medical advice or mental health treatment. Please consult with a medical or mental health professional if you believe you are in need of mental health treatment. In today's episode of the Psychedelic Therapy Frontiers podcast, we're talking with psychotherapist Curt Kearney about his new book, Psychedelics and Internal Family Systems, or IFS, a partnership in relational healing. IFS is a powerful therapy model that's becoming very popular these days. When we talk about which psychotherapy models might pair well with psychedelic tools, IFS is usually somewhere near the top of the list, if not at the top of the list. In his book and in this conversation, Curt draws from his extensive experience with psychedelics and as an IFS practitioner and trainer to walk us through how one might use IFS with psychedelic tools in a synergistic, in a especially relational way. If you want to learn more about Curt, there are links to his website and a link to the book in the show notes. For those of you who are new to our show, welcome. Psychedelic Therapy Frontiers is brought to you by Numinous Network and is hosted by me, Dr. Steve Thayer, and my co-host, Dr. Reid Robison. Just a couple of quick announcements before we get to the interview. If you're looking for comprehensive foundational training in psychedelic-assisted therapy that includes live online classes, experiential learning, and opportunities to connect with a diverse community of practitioners in the psychedelic medicine space, then check out our courses. We're currently offering 10% off select courses for PTF podcast listeners, so click on the link in the show notes or go directly to numinousnetwork.com/training and use the code PDF10 for that 10% discount. If you've listened to the show for a while, you've likely heard Reid and I talk about the psychedelic clinical trial work that Numinous Network does. If you or someone you know might be interested in being a participant in a psychedelic clinical trial, you can click on the link in the show notes or go directly to numinousnetwork.com/research to learn more about the trials we're currently running. If you'd like to support the show, here's how you do it. You can leave us a positive rating or review in places like Apple Podcasts or Spotify. If you're watching on YouTube, please like the video, subscribe to the channel, maybe leave a comment below, and share the episode with someone you think might enjoy it. Without further delay, here's our interview today with psychotherapist Curt Kearney.